looks like President Obama's plans to fight global warming are going to hurt America's suburbs. And that's because the Obama administration believes in something called smart growth. Now, the idea of smart growth policies is that you should get out of your car, don't move to the suburbs, you should live in a tiny, densely packed apartment building in the city where you would walk and take public transportation, don't drive. And that's smart growth, and the Obama administration is gearing up to impose these smart growth policies on the country, and that would be bad for America's suburbs.
How would they do it? How would they make us move from the suburbs to the city? Because most of the folks who live in the suburbs like the suburbs. They don't want to live in the city. How would they make us do it?
Well, there are several plans, Megan, and part of the idea is just to stop people from moving out to the suburbs in the first place. But in the end, it might even get some people who are living in suburbs to head to the cities. Last week, the Energy Department released a series of reports that touted a new strategy for cutting back on carbon dioxide emissions. The idea is to make all federal funding conditional on adherence to these smart growth principles. So let's say the federal government is thinking of funding a new school or a new highway. Well, if this idea goes through, the government would say, let's look at the population density. If you've got a high population density, we'll give you the federal money. If you don't, you're not going to get the money. And that would start channeling new development away from the suburbs and into the cities. And if you think about it, it's actually a way of redistributing the wealth of the suburbs to the cities.
This is an actual proposal that was put forward?
Well, a report came out called Transportation Energy Futures, and one of these reports floated this proposal. At this stage, it's a trial balloon, I think you could say, but there's another similar proposal that, according to a news report, the Obama administration has already decided on. And that is that the Obama administration, for the first time, is going to tell every agency of the federal government to consider carbon dioxide emissions before they give environmental approval to big projects. And that could mean big delays, big challenges, maybe even the elimination of some, say, highway construction projects out into the suburbs. So if you want to have that traffic congestion relieved on your suburban commute, or maybe opening up a new area for suburban development with a highway, that could be delayed and possibly even blocked by these new regulations, and that again would tend to channel development away from the suburbs and back to the cities.
Now, you talk in your piece, which was posted on National Review Online, about how, yes, of course, this focuses in part, this initiative that's been proposed focuses in part on greenhouse gas emissions and making the environment more green, and, you know, your carbon footprint when you live in a little 800-square-foot apartment in Manhattan is much, much smaller than if you live in, you know, a 3,000-square-foot home in the burbs. So that's clear. That could be one of the goals. But you also say that this is about wealth redistribution on a grand scale. How so? How is it a redistribution of wealth?
Well, that's what I talk about in the book, Megan. If you go back to Obama's whole political history, people don't realize it, but he's been a big backer of a movement called regionalism. The whole idea of regionalism is that there's something fundamentally unfair about the very existence of suburbs, because when people move out to suburbs, they take their tax money with them. And President Obama and some of the people he used to work with in his political career believed that that was somehow unfair to the cities. So if you put in these smart growth policies and you say it's all about carbon dioxide and global warming, you still are channeling all that federal money, which comes from all of our taxes after all, into the cities and away from the suburbs. And that's a way of redistributing wealth from the suburbs to the cities. And in the minds of these advocates of regionalism that Obama has always worked with, this is a way of redistributing money back away from the suburbs and into the cities.
But you still, I mean, you still have the same crop of people. So if you're forcing folks who live in the suburbs to eventually move back into the city, or people who live in the city not to move out to the suburbs, it's still the same people. You're not going to change their political worldview. You're not going to change their voting habits necessarily.
Well, some people think it might change voting habits. It's unclear whether that will really happen. But the point for these regionalists is that you're stopping tax money from being taken away from the cities and put into the suburbs. These regionalists think that there's something fundamentally unfair about that. So what they first want to do is get taxpayers back to the cities so that their money can go into the coffers of those city governments and not the suburban governments. And maybe the politics will take care of itself after that.
You call it an effort to Manhattanize America. And a lot of our viewers won't like the thought of that, since there's a reason they've chosen not to live in Manhattan, and it's not just the, you know, lock jam traffic at rush hour and the taxi cabs and the pollution and all that. Sorry, Mayor Bloomberg, but you know what I'm talking about. And they don't necessarily want Iowa to look like Manhattan. But in any event, Stanley, very interesting hearing your perspective. Thank you, sir.
The Wildlands Project is a very well-funded effort to lock up as much as 50% of the United States into wilderness. It is heavily promoted by most environmental, non-governmental organizations. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, helped create it in the mid-1980s to be the foundation of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which the IUCN wrote in 1982. The IUCN is an international group of over 1,000 NGO and government members.
Environmental groups have effectively created a public image as organizations caring for helpless species and protecting environments. This has allowed them to implement an agenda in America that, if fully exposed, would be opposed by the majority of the people. In fact, most people supporting these organizations are not aware of their long-term objective, even though it is no secret. Take a look at the Wildlands map. It defines where environmentalists want to take America in the very near future. The areas in red will be off-limits to humans. The areas in yellow represent buffer zones, where limited use is allowed primarily to travel to and from populated areas. The areas in green are where normal use by humans will be allowed. However, by the environmentalists' own admission, these normal use areas would be restricted. When this plan was first published in 1992, the author, Reed Noss, explained how their agenda would affect the human population. He stated, eventually a wilderness network would dominate a region and thus would itself constitute the matrix, with human habitations being the islands. No one, not even the longtime opponents of the environmental movement, believed such a transforming agenda was possible. However, it is being implemented quickly through innocent-sounding programs that most Americans support. Wilderness areas, critical habitat for endangered species, wetlands, roadless areas, national heritage areas, and other restrictive programs are sold to the public as necessary to protect nature, or as assurance that Americans will always have a place to escape from the heavily populated cities. More inventive tools and programs, such as conservation easements, smart growth, open space, and greenlining, are being promoted as a way to control growth. What all these programs have in common is extinguishing the private property rights of American citizens and transferring the control of the property to elite land trusts or directly to the government. The environmental movement would not be able to implement their agenda without the cooperation of our government at all levels, including state and federal officials and even county commissioners. To help facilitate the environmental goals, the Clinton administration quietly created the Gap Analysis Program, or GAP for short. GAP divides the land into ecosystem regions and identifies the properties not yet under the control of state and federal governments. In other words, private property. These private holdings are then targeted for preservation by government agencies and land trusts through conservation easements, purchase, and condemnation. Although the GAP program has not been completed in all states, the data from this project is already being strategically used to target landowners. Not surprisingly, the areas of protection defined by GAP follow closely along the same boundaries as those shown on the Wildlands map. It is frightening to see how much of America's land has recently been consumed as a result of this agenda. For instance, the state of Florida utilized the data from GAP to implement an aggressive preservation plan called Florida Forever. Since the early 1990s, over 2 million acres in the state of Florida have been locked up through this program. The private property owners within the target area were forced to give up their land under the pressure of extreme environmental regulations, purchase, and outright condemnation. And the Florida Forever campaign is not complete. At the current rate that environmentalists are implementing their agenda in every state, in every county, and soon in every town, private property is quickly being eliminated. It will not take the 80 to 100 years they originally projected to complete their task. They are much closer to achieving their goal than anyone realizes. Environmentalists have scared Americans into thinking that if we continue to live as we are today, the earth will self-destruct, species will die, and the globe will be covered with development. However, government data shows that only 6% of America's land mass is currently developed. Only 3% of America is classified as urban. Yet 77% of all Americans live in these urban areas. The rest is still largely untouched by humans. The problem is not that our nation is being overdeveloped. The problem is as old as time. It is about who will own the land. Large amounts of the nation's natural resources are still owned by private citizens. America's founders vehemently opposed the concept of government or elitists owning the land in America, which would result in the citizens being leaseholders and serfs. One of the most well-known property rights advocates of our time, Wayne Hage, said it best. Either you have the right to own property, or you are property. Make no mistake, this battle is not about whether the land will be used, resources extracted, and wealth created, but by whom. Karl Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, "The theory of the communist may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property." America's founding father, John Adams, stated, "Property must be secured or liberty cannot exist." Which course will America take? Hear directly from Dr. Michael Kaufman, the man who first uncovered the Wildlands map and presented it to the U.S. Senate. Kaufman will reveal the details of the environmental agenda and how the government is helping to transfer land ownership in America. He explores each region and explains the tactics they are using in the different areas. You will learn what might be used to target your land. Environmentalists are counting on their agenda never being fully revealed. Taking Liberty is committed to seeing that it is. Their plan must be stopped before all of our liberty is taken.
We need to meet a new constraint, and that constraint has to do with CO2. CO2 is warming the planet, and the equation on CO2 is actually a very straightforward one. If you sum up the CO2 that gets emitted, that leads to a temperature increase, and that temperature increase leads to some very negative effects. The effects on the weather, perhaps worse, the indirect effects in that the natural ecosystems can't adjust to these rapid changes, and so you get ecosystem collapses. Now, the exact amount of how you map from a certain increase in of CO2 to what temperature will be and where the positive feedbacks are, there's some uncertainty there, but not very much. And there's certainly uncertainty about how bad those effects will be, but they will be extremely bad. I asked the top scientists on this several times, do we really have to get down to near zero? Can't we just, cut it in half or a quarter? And the answer is that until we get near to zero, the temperature will continue to rise. And so that's a big challenge. It's very different than saying, we're a 12-foot high truck trying to get under a 10-foot bridge and we can just sort of squeeze under. This is something that has to get to zero. Now, we put out a lot of carbon dioxide every year, over 26 billion tons. For each American, it's about 20 tons. For people in poor countries, it's less than 1 ton. It's an average about 5 tons for everyone on the planet. And somehow we have to make changes that will bring that down to zero. It's been constantly going up. It's only various economic changes that have even flattened it at all. So we have to go from rapidly rising to falling and falling all the way to zero. This equation has 4 factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra. But let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. But there we see an increase of about 1.3. The second factor is the services we use.